Our next session is laying the foundation, strengthening innovation capacity. Each of the speakers will have 15 minutes presentation. And our first speaker is Professor Stefan Kuhlmann. He is a professor of Science, Technology and Society and chair of the Department of Science, Technology and Policy Studies at University of Twente. He has served as president of the European Forum for Studies of Policies for Research and Innovation since 2010. He is a co-editor of Research Policy and editorial advisor to several other journals, including Asian Research Policy. Today, he will give a talk on responsible innovation and the quest to meet grand social challenges, policy ambitions in Europe. Please welcome Dr. Kuhlmann.
Now, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Pleasure for me to be able to have the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the fact that we have a great audience here. This afternoon I wanted to speak about innovation policies, and in particular about two recent discussions and policy orientations that are taking ground, at least in Europe, that might also be interesting to be considered by this audience. First of all, in order to position these two new trends, I wanted to very quickly position where we stand. From there, say a few words about potential needs to change our research and innovation systems and relatedly innovation policy, and then talk in more depth about these two trends. One is called the need to meet the grand societal challenges, also through innovation policy. And the other one overlapping with that is the need to introduce more responsible ways of doing research and innovation. Now, innovation, where do we stand? Here are some basics that I think everybody in this room will know. The fact that innovation is important for economic development is widely shared. The previous session was very clear about that. There is widely shared definitions of innovation. We heard already this morning in the presentation by Dr. Park, related information. This is just the OECD definition that I'm mentioning here. It is accepted that innovative efforts are an important reason for the differences in growth in economies across countries, widely accepted. I mean, Korea is a fantastic example of such a development, so we know that. About innovation, we know in the meantime it cannot easily be planned. It occurs in uncertainty. It is path dependent, so innovation capacity builds upon previous experience. It co-evolves with society. This is something that has become more and more important and better understood recently. And that means also that innovation draws on varieties of actors that in one way or the other do contribute to it. And innovation builds a lot on the abilities of actors in societies and economies to learn. Often, but not always, innovation is spurred by close linkages with science and high technology. On the other hand, we also know that there are important innovation processes and efforts that are rather driven by demand, including non-technological sources or low technological input. Innovation builds on soft factors also, which is related services and the like. innovation is shaped by the institutional context and by public policy in the area. That has become largely understood, and that has brought us, and that is summarized very nicely in the here we are, in the concept of innovation systems or innovation ecosystems, a kind of reasoning and understanding of innovation in context that is widely shared for now 20, 25 years in most countries. The fact that innovation happens as cooperative effort between industries, research and education, all kinds of infrastructures, the demand in the market, and not least support by public policy and political systems. So the efforts by public policy are central to innovation processes in most contexts, not always, but in most contexts. That has been also largely understood. In social sciences, for instance, my background, more and more people in the recent years have worked on a better understanding of innovation policy. For instance, you look at publication and citation information, you would see this incredible rise of publications in the field during the last 15 years, roughly speaking. There's an ever-growing scope of innovation policy instruments around. There's a change of the justification of innovation policy from the classical market failure argument, which is still around, of course, but more and more towards system failure. The idea that in an overarching system, the ecosystem, something might be wrong, might lead or might help to generate a legitimation for public policy efforts, for governmental efforts. Accordingly, innovation policy has been considered as oriented towards system change, systemic, and the list of goals that you see here, for instance, coming from a recent overview produced by the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research, shows this wide scope of goals that are largely systemically oriented. And also, innovation policy, if you look at the targets of innovation policy, are increasingly broadening the scope and the areas covered. Now there's not only on policies aiming at innovation in industry, but also in wider societal areas, including areas of social welfare and the like that are covered by the notion of innovation policy. Here, this graph shows, I have no time now to explain that in detail, this broad scope of goals and instruments that nowadays is around, at least in leading industrial countries, but we see also in developing countries an increasing scope of varieties of innovation-related policies in place. Now that brings us to that was the background, brings us to the first of the two more recent trends in the debates and also orientations for policymakers. That is, the idea that innovation policy should help to address and mitigate the so-called grand societal challenges. And you might certainly have most of them, because there's a number of discussions around. It's about the future of health and how to cope with demographic change. It's about food. It is about energy, clean energy. It's about good transportation. It's about the question how to cope with climate change. And in Europe, one has added also the need, or the idea to cope with societal positive development, including inclusiveness. That was the discussion we had in the previous session, and I said let's discuss that in the next session. It is meant to be an orientation that thinks of inclusion of all groups in society in the economic development that is based on innovation efforts. Secure society is also one. Now, these grand societal challenges have to be, if they should become subject of innovation policy, then they're also subject of considerations about governance. We would make the claim that, in a way, the attempt to address grand challenges through governance forms a challenge in itself. Why? Because can we address grand challenges only with the classical instruments of research and innovation support? Partly, yes, I would say, but certainly not completely. Can we treat grand challenges like decades ago, the Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb, or the Apollo project, the man to the moon mission, with relatively unambiguous targets? At the end of the road, probably not. Rather, grand challenges pertain to heterogeneous, different, new actors and forces that need to be mobilized, guided, integrated, and that would also partly or can include social innovation. So grand challenges, in a way, are open-ended missions. They often will concern the socio-economic system as a whole, involve different actors, and would also could even lead to system transformations. If this is true, then in terms of policy and governance, we can say no one-fits-all policy approach would be appropriate here. Rather, one would need what we would call tentative policy mixes, prudent, explorative, experimental, facilitating system change. It can draw on existing classical priority setting measures and related implementation approaches, but also aim at transformation and breakthrough. And it would often have to involve demand-side stimulating activities and procurement policies, for instance. It would focus on system-oriented strategic interventions and related changes. What that would mean, one would have to involve key actors involved, also key actors outside of the classical realm of S&T and innovation policy making, including charitable foundations, for instance, which are very active in dealing with, for instance, medical issues in large parts of the world, civil society organizations. It would involve economic and social change in terms of social innovation, meaning innovation that is mainly relevant in the way organizations function. It would enable intermediary organizations to participate. Concerted action would be required. And here, government would be required to play the role of a coordinating actor, because ideally it is stable, trustable, non-partisan, and ready to invest, ideally. And that's the way we discuss it, at least in Europe. An example is here we have a number of initiatives, for instance, the so-called joint technology initiatives of the European Union. Here's an example called the Innovative Medicines Initiative, IMI. It's a major effort aiming to improve health across the system, in particular where important medical needs are unmet so far. It is designed as a partnership of the European Union, governments, and pharmaceutical industries, major pharmaceutical industries in Europe, but it also involves patient organizations, regulatory organizations, procuring organizations. In that sense, you could call it is such an approach like the one that I tried to sketch a few slides earlier, an inclusive effort to address major grand societal challenges. Lots of money are spent here, and the European Union has played in particular the role of a coordinator in that very context. So it's not only an important sponsor, but more than that, far more than that, is in particular an enabler of the related strategic actions. Now, conceptually speaking, we think that these kind of approaches need public-private collaboration. They need what we call a tentative concept of governance, a prudent, experimental one, designed, practiced, exercised, and evolving through a dynamic process of managing the interdependencies between participating partners in a non-finalizing way, open, which also means it creates and needs spaces for openness, for probing and learning for the various participating actors. And that, even more conceptually speaking, is, here we are, can be considered as being embedded in what we call meta-governance. Meta-governance has been defined as the governance of governance, as a facilitating context within which complex efforts like those joint technology initiatives can evolve, where this can be facilitated. Meta-governance measures have a kind of the function of crash barriers. Think yourself on a highway, and you have the crash barriers helping you to keep things under control to some degree. Think, for instance, to give an example of the rules, the explicit ones or implicit ones that are used within international cooperation, for instance, to meet the climate change. So you have overarching governance arrangements between all participating actors, although they are independent in what they are doing, these actors. So meta-governance helps to facilitate these complexities. That brings me to the second issue I wanted to address, meeting grand challenges in search. That was the first one, how to cope with grand challenges from a governance perspective, requiring new approaches for innovation policy. The second one is overlapping with that. This is the quest for what has been called responsible research and innovation. RRI is now a very fashionable term in Europe these days. It is built, or it draws on earlier concepts. Think of the concept of corporate social responsibility, or the concept of technology assessment, or the precautionary principle when it comes to emerging technologies, or the studies into ethical, legal aspects of innovation. There's a number of concepts. Anyhow, RRI is now trying to capture all of this in Europe and trying to make debatable the orientations, the directionality of research and innovation activities in order to meet the grand societal challenges, in order to anticipate and take risks and take ethical considerations seriously, in order to align the development of research and innovation with societal demands and values. And that also would mean that one would include varieties of stakeholders in the process and encourage their active participation. Now, RRI, as I said, has become very, very fashionable these days. There's related programs in the United Kingdom, in the Netherlands, in Norway. The new framework program of the European Union for the next years, this major investment program, has also taken on board the notion of RRI. There's a particular unit in the European Commission dealing with it. Last year there was a major conference in Rome which was putting forward a definition of RRI and was very clearly saying that there is a need for more responsibility orientation in research and innovation systems. But even the European Industrial Research Management Association has taken RRI on board and are developing own initiatives in that respect. Again here, if one wants to develop research and innovation systems towards indeed becoming more responsible, one needs a governance approach towards that. It cannot simply be imposed. There's presently running a major project, the Resagora project, a project dealing with developing of a governance framework for RRI. I'm involved in that project. If you're interested, you can look it up. There's a link where our various activities are being described. The overarching aim of the project is to find ways for governance in research innovation processes, related organizations, to make actors themselves more responsible in the sense that they themselves develop a responsibility orientation. You can call that responsibilization of the actors in the system. And in order to facilitate this, we are now, these days, developing a tool, kind of think tool, for actors, for decision makers. I've tested it during the last month, a number of high-level stakeholder workshops across Europe, and some of people here in the room were also participating in it, in the stakeholder workshops. Tested it, and we call it an RRI navigator, a thinking tool for decision makers to help them to improve the ways responsibility issues are organized in their related organizations and activities along three major dimensions. That is the qualities of interaction between all participating parties, inclusion, moderation, deliberation, particular governance mechanism, flexibility, subsidiarity, adaptability, supportive conditions, capacity building, capability building, institutional entrepreneurship, and democratic standards. I have no time now to discuss that in detail. There's another presentation. But you can look it up and follow it if you're interested in this website, where we will organize a major international conference in January next year, when hopefully all results are ready and can be presented to the public. To conclude, increasingly in research innovation systems, one tries to cope with complex phenomena that require transformation of systems. The grand challenges discussion is part of that, but also the attempt to introduce responsibility in innovation systems. It requires a systematic approach. It requires a serious inclusion of societal actors in the processes, not only science, technology, policy, and in companies, of course. It requires room for experimentation and learning, and it requires forms of what we would call tentative governance, meaning experimental, learning-oriented. So this is what I wanted to share with you. But in order to be able to do that, I think we also need in our systems analytical and policy intelligence, so people who are able to think about the requirements for these kind of processes. And that's what many people here in the room are busy with, and also myself. That's what I try to do for many years now, to develop analytical and policy intelligence. Since tomorrow you will establish the new network, the Asian Think Tank Network. I just wanted to share with you the fact that for now 5 years we have in Europe a related network, that is the European Forum for Studies of the Policies of Research and Innovation, the USPRI Forum. It's an organization of 16 institutes in our field, a bottom-up voluntary organization organizing major conferences. Last one was in June in Helsinki. Some people in the room here were in Helsinki at the conference. If you're interested, you can look it up. There's a link. And there's other networks in the world, for instance, in the Americas, with whom we are collaborating, which might also be very interesting as partners for your network. That's my point that I wanted to share with you at the very end of my presentation. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kuhlmann. We will have several questions for Q&A afterward.